Love in Bridgerton has never been the problem. It's what love exposes that destroys people. Because in a world where every glance is monitored, every word is dissected, and every silence is louder than a confession, falling in love is not romantic. It's reckless. And no one understood that better than Benedict Bridgerton. You see, the Ton will forgive many things. A poorly timed remark, a questionable fashion choice, even a scandal, if it can be controlled. But there is one thing it will never forgive. A love story it cannot categorize, a woman it cannot place, a truth it cannot rewrite. And that is exactly where Sophie appears. Not as a debutante, not as a duchess, not even as a proper participant in the game, but as a disruption, a flaw in a system that was designed to be flawless. The Ton prides itself on elegance, on structure, on the comforting illusion that everything and everyone has a place. Young women are presented to society as if they are stepping into freedom. White gowns, polite applause, futures that seem limitless. But let's be precise, their futures are not limitless. They are pre-approved, curated, carefully filtered through generations of expectation, reputation, and quiet agreements that no one ever says out loud, but everyone obeys. Because in this world, choice is not about what you want. It is about what you are allowed to want. And Benedict was never supposed to want Sophie, not because she lacked beauty, not because she lacked intelligence, but because she lacked something far more important: context. The Ton does not fear scandal the way people think it does. Scandal can be managed, contained, redirected. What it fears is ambiguity. A woman with no clear standing is not simply overlooked, she is dangerous. Because the system cannot predict her, it cannot rank her. It cannot decide whether she is beneath notice or above suspicion. And in a society built entirely on knowing exactly where everyone stands, that kind of uncertainty is not just uncomfortable, it is unacceptable. This is why Sophie was never meant to exist in Benedict's world. Because the moment he sees her, not as a curiosity, not as a passing intrigue, but as something real, the entire structure begins to crack. And here is where the illusion becomes almost cruel. Because Benedict believes he has a choice. He believes he can admire her quietly, desire her privately, perhaps even love her discreetly. As if love in this world has ever been discreet. As if the Ton, this vast whispering network of observation and interpretation, has ever missed anything that mattered. It hasn't. It never does. Every look lingers a second too long. Every absence raises a question. Every coincidence becomes a pattern waiting to be confirmed. And the most dangerous part? No one needs proof. They only need a story. Because in the Ton, a story does not require evidence. It requires momentum. And once that momentum begins, it does not stop. So the real question is not whether Benedict and Sophie fall in love. The real question is this: who notices first? And what do they decide to do with it? There is a particular kind of threat the Ton does not know how to neutralize. Not a rival, not a scandal, not even a rebellion, but a woman who exists without permission, because Sophie does not arrive with a title that can be announced, a lineage that can be verified, or a reputation that can be strategically managed. She arrives as something far more destabilizing, unclassified, and in a system that survives by labeling, ranking, and quietly sorting every person into their appropriate place. That is not just inconvenient, it is intolerable. You have to understand, this world is not chaotic. It is engineered. Every introduction is calculated. Every alliance is negotiated long before it appears spontaneous. Even attraction is expected to follow rules. A gentleman may admire beauty, yes. He may flirt, within reason. He may even pursue, but always, always, within the invisible boundaries of acceptability, because desire in the Ton is not meant to disrupt structure. It is meant to reinforce it. And Sophie does the opposite. She does not reinforce anything. She unsettles it. Her presence creates questions where there should be certainty. And questions in this world are dangerous not because of the answers they produce, but because of the attention they attract. And attention is where everything begins to unravel. Because the moment people start asking, "Who is she?" they are no longer simply observing, they are investigating. And investigation in the ton is never neutral. It is motivated, strategic, hungry. Some will ask out of curiosity. Others will ask because they sense opportunity, because a woman with no clear identity is not just a mystery. She is a blank space, and blank spaces are meant to be filled with assumptions, with whispers, with stories that grow, more detailed and more damaging with every retelling. This is how it starts, not with accusation, not with scandal, but with a question asked lightly, almost carelessly in the corner of a ballroom. Do you know who she is? And when no one can answer with certainty, the tone does what it does best. It invents. Now here is where the situation becomes almost dangerously ironic, because Sophie, in any other world, might have been invisible, overlooked, dismissed. But in this world, invisibility does not protect you. It exposes you, because the less people know about you, the more power they have to define you. And definitions, once accepted by enough people, become reality, not truth. Reality. And Benedict walks directly into this without understanding the rules he is breaking. Because to him, Sophie is not a question, she is an answer to something he has not been able to name, something that exists beyond the rehearsed interactions and carefully curated connections of his world. He sees her, and for a moment, the system disappears. But systems like this do not disappear. They observe, they wait, and then they respond. Because the ton is not a passive audience, it is an active force, a collective intelligence that notices patterns long before individuals are willing to admit them. A glance repeated too often, a conversation that lingers too long, a gentleman, particularly one like Benedict, showing interest where interest does not make sense. And once that pattern is detected, the interpretation begins. Not publicly, not immediately, but quietly, efficiently, and with a precision that feels almost surgical. Because here is the truth, the ton understands better than anyone. It is not the relationship that creates scandal. It is the narrative built around it. And Sophie, without a name, without protection, without a history that can defend her, is the perfect subject for a narrative she cannot control. So the whispers begin to take shape, not as accusations, not yet, but as possibilities. And possibilities in the right hands are far more dangerous than facts, because facts can be challenged. Possibilities can only be expanded. So what happens when those possibilities start pointing in one direction? When curiosity becomes suspicion, and suspicion begins to harden into belief? And more importantly, when Benedict finally realizes that loving Sophie is not just a personal risk, but a public declaration the ton will not allow to exist? There is a precise moment, quiet, almost invisible, when something private stops belonging to the people living it and starts belonging to everyone watching it. Not when the truth is revealed, not when the secret is spoken out loud, but when the pattern becomes undeniable. Because the ton does not wait for confirmation. It does not require evidence. It does not even particularly care about accuracy. It cares about coherence, about whether a story makes sense, and more importantly, whether it is useful. And Benedict and Sophie, they begin to make sense. Not to each other, that part was never the issue, but to the observers, to the women who notice that he looks for her before anyone else enters a room, to the men who register, with quiet amusement or calculated interest, that his attention is no longer strategically placed, to the people who understand that deviation, especially from someone like Benedict, is never random. It is always a signal. And once something is interpreted as a signal, it invites interpretation. This is how it shifts. Slowly at first, a glance becomes a preference becomes a pattern becomes a conclusion, and a conclusion becomes a story. Now here is the part most people misunderstand. Stories in the ton are not created all at once. They are assembled, piece by piece, voice by voice, each person adding just enough detail to make it more compelling, more believable, more impossible to ignore. One person recalls seeing them speak. perhaps a little too privately. Another mentions that she has appeared in places where she should not have access. A third, more perceptive, or perhaps more ambitious, begins to ask the more dangerous question: why would he risk this? And that question is where everything changes. Because once motive enters the conversation, the story stops being about what is happening and starts being about what it means. Is it infatuation, rebellion, desperation, or worse, is it serious? And seriousness in this context is not romantic. It is catastrophic. Because a fleeting interest can be dismissed, a temporary distraction can be ignored, but intention demands response. And the ton always responds. This is where the machinery accelerates. Because now, the story is no longer passive. It is being shaped, directed, guided toward a version that serves the interests of the people telling it. And here is the most dangerous truth of all: the story does not need to destroy Benedict. He is protected by name, by family, by position. It will bend around him if necessary. It will reinterpret his actions in ways that preserve his standing. But Sophie is not protected. She is adaptable, which is to say, the story can do whatever it wants with her. She can become the ambition behind his distraction, the impropriety behind his behavior, the explanation that makes everything else make sense. And once she becomes that, she is no longer a person. She is a function, a role in a narrative that has already decided its ending. Now consider the elegance of this system. No accusations are made directly. No confrontation is required. No single person can be blamed because everyone is participating. Just enough to remain innocent. Just enough to claim they only repeated what they heard. Just enough to avoid responsibility while ensuring the story continues to spread. This is not chaos. This is coordination, unspoken but remarkably precise. And Benedict, whether he realizes it or not, is no longer simply in love. He is at the center of a narrative that is gaining momentum with every passing moment. A narrative that does not need his consent, that does not require his approval. And that will not stop simply because he wishes it would. Because by the time you are aware of the story in the ton, it is already too late to control it. So the question is no longer whether the truth will come out. The truth at this point is almost irrelevant. The real question is far more dangerous. When the story finally reaches him, will he recognize it for what it is? Or will he make the fatal mistake of believing he can still change how it ends? There is a moment in every carefully controlled system when it is forced to reveal what it truly values. Not what it claims to value, not what it performs in candlelit ballrooms and polite conversations, but what it protects when something threatens to disrupt it. And in the ton, what is protected is not love. It is order. It is predictability. It is the quiet, unspoken agreement that everyone will play their role and never question why those roles exist in the first place. Benedict has lived inside this agreement his entire life, comfortably, effortlessly, with just enough distance to believe he is different from it, without ever actually stepping outside of it. Until now. Because loving Sophie is not simply a romantic decision, it is a structural violation. It challenges the hierarchy, it ignores the classifications, it refuses to participate in the careful choreography that keeps everything running smoothly. And systems like this do not tolerate refusal. They correct it. Subtly, at first, a conversation here, a warning disguised as concern, a suggestion that perhaps he is misunderstanding his own feelings. Because the ton does not immediately attack what it can still redirect. It gives you a chance to return to alignment, to correct the deviation before it becomes something more difficult to contain. But here is where Benedict becomes dangerous. Not because he is reckless, not because he is defiant, but because he hesitates, and then continues anyway. And hesitation in this world is a signal. It tells everyone watching that this is not a passing curiosity. This is a choice, a deliberate one, and deliberate choices must be answered. So the tone shifts, the subtlety fades, and the story, now fully formed, now fully circulating, begins to harden into something far less flexible. Reputation. Because once a narrative settles into reputation, it stops evolving. It becomes fixed, accepted, repeated without question. And here's the part that makes this system so brutally efficient. Reputation does not need to be fair. It only needs to be believed. Sophie, by now, is no longer an uncertainty. She is defined, not by who she is, but by what the story has decided she represents. And once that definition takes hold, it begins to close doors she never even realized were open. Conversations stop when she enters a room. Invitations quietly fail to arrive. Eyes linger, not with curiosity now, but with recognition. Recognition of a narrative they already understand. And Benedict sees it. Perhaps not immediately, perhaps not all at once, but slowly, unmistakably, he begins to understand the scale of what has been set in motion. Because this is the cost the Ton never announces up front. Not the whispers, not the speculation, but the isolation. The quiet, systematic removal of a person from the spaces that once defined their existence. And here is the final cruelty. He can stop it at any moment. All he has to do is step back, withdraw, allow the story to collapse without his continued involvement. And the Ton, generous in its own calculated way, will forgive him. It will reinterpret his actions. Call it a love.